Hey guys, it's Alex, and I'm here with a book review for a book that I read all the way back in October and didn't get around to reviewing until now, and that is A Stolen Life by Jaycee Dugard. This was a book I'd had on my shelf for a while, but I picked it up on the recommendation from Emma Novella. She said it was one of her favorite memoirs, and since I had it, I just decided to randomly read it, and it was very enjoyable. This tells the story of Jaycee Dugard, who was kidnapped when she was 11 years old. She was then held prisoner and didn't actually manage to escape until 19 years later. By the time she escaped, she had two children who were teenagers, and she'd pretty much lost a good portion of her life. I was already familiar with her story. This happened in America, and I was in 8th or ninth grade when she escaped. So I had seen some news coverage, and I was aware of who she was as a person, but I didn't know many specifics of her story, other than that she'd been kidnapped as a small child. Now she had daughters of her own, and was held for almost 20 years. It's a very heart-wrenching story, and I think that's something you'll expect going in. There's a lot of sexual abuse. There's a lot of trigger warnings for abuse and kidnapping and pretty much anything you can imagine when it comes to this story. It's awful to read, and it's a very touching story. I gave this book 4 stars and thoroughly enjoyed it. I've seen a number of mixed reviews for it online, and I think that comes down to whether or not you're okay with the writing style. Most memoirs like this, I tend to assume they've been ghostwritten, whether or not it says they've been written with someone. And I kind of went into this book with that assumption, but honestly, after reading it, it really wouldn't surprise me if Jaycee Dugard had written this whole thing by herself, with obviously an editor to fix things and pretty it up a bit, but it very much does sound like she may have done the bulk of the writing herself. The writing is not good in the traditional sense. I just want to put that out there. It's not written like a professional writer would write a book. It's not particularly well done. It's very disjointed. It's very simplistic. It can be very short and terse, and it can be a bit confusing to follow at times for that reason. And it sounds like it was written by an 11-year-old. And I think it was an intentional choice that Jaycee Dugard made when writing this book. She wrote it the way she experienced it. She wrote it with her limited education. She wrote it the way her 11-year-old self had experienced everything and the way she went through it. And I think that, above anything else, really made me enjoy this book. It sounded like her. It sounded like a child. And it made me so much closer to the story. It made the story so much more relatable because it didn't feel like a professional writer taking her story and manufacturing it. It felt real. I think that will be a detriment to some people reading this. I think that does make it kind of difficult to read at points, but overall, for me, the writing style really benefited the story and offered really great insight into her as a person. She also included reflections at the end of most chapters, which sounded very different from the story itself, which is part of the reason I do think that the writing style was an intentional choice. They're not particularly well written, but they do sound like they were written by an adult, whereas the bulk of the story really sounds like it was coming from a child. If you asked a 5th grader to write about these things, it would sound largely like the story. I really enjoyed the reflections. She was writing it in the first person present tense, so it's like everything was happening right now. You were experiencing it in the moment. Everything was very immediate. And then she would take a pause and go to the reflections, and you'd see where she was now. You'd see certain things that she didn't understand then, but now she does. And I felt that really added to the story. I really enjoyed that aspect. This book also made me very emotional, and to be perfectly honest, that's rare in memoirs. Like, yes, horrible things were happening to her, but I read a fair number of memoirs, and most of them tend to be about horrible things happening. And not many of them make me emotional. This had me tearing up. I don't know that I cried at all, but I was definitely tearing up and feeling quite emotional. And I think a lot of that has to do with the writing style. It wasn't a professional writer. It wasn't someone taking the story and cleaning it up and making it all nice and pretty to read. It was her. It was an 11-year-old child talking about all these awful things that are happening to her, and it really touched me. I think that's something to be aware of going in, even if it is an incredibly difficult subject, and it's something that I think, even if you think you can handle it, it does make you very emotional. Like, even when it comes to the kinds of stories like this, I would put this book kind of a step above them in that regard. One thing that I did kind of notice was that this story felt like a first draft. Not because there were any kind of typos or grammatical errors, but the way things were told felt like she was writing the story stream of consciousness as she thought of things. There were random journal entries thrown in. At the beginning, she was doing reflections consistently at the end of every chapter, and then she stopped for a while, and then she started back up but wasn't doing them all the time. There were things like using brackets versus footnotes when she was referencing something. And just in general, the storytelling didn't feel like it was very well thought out. And normally that's something that bothers me a lot in a book, when you can notice that it feels like this is a first draft. She went through, wrote it once, and that was it. But it's something I do understand with this book. Like, maybe she did write it just the one time. Maybe she turned it in and then the editor cleaned it up and made it nice enough to print. But it did feel like she'd only written it once, and there hadn't been major revisions all the way through the story. It didn't really detract too much from the story, though, because it was all in one take. It made it feel a little bit more raw, and I think that was sort of the impact of the story for me, was that it was very, very raw. There was nothing polished about this. It was just an incredibly emotional journey. Overall, this was just a very emotional, very graphic book, so I understand it's not for everyone in that regard, and it's also a little bit rough when it comes to the technical aspects, so I think if you can get past both of those things, this is a wonderful book, and I would highly, highly recommend it. It was incredibly worthwhile to read, and honestly, I think it only took me about a day or two to get through this, because it was so well done, and I never wanted to put it down, even though I desperately wanted to look away at the same time. Let me know down below if you've read this book and what you thought of it if you have. I'd be very curious to see how anyone else felt about this, because I do think it can be kind of a polarizing book when it comes to the writing. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see y'all again soon.